I'm really honored. I think it's a great privilege to participate in this event honoring Professor Vogel. And I just thinking back to when I first encountered him, September 1979, in fact, my very first week as a freshman at Harvard. And I happened to follow a classmate that I thought was cute into a class that I didn't know very much about. It was a full year course on the history and culture of Japan and China. And the Crimson Q Guide kind of snarkily had identified it as Rice Paddies 101. And it was taught by Ed Reichauer and Henry Rozovsky, and a sociologist that just that year had published a surprise bestseller called Japan is Number One. And I remember that the girl who sort of enticed me into that class lost interest in it and left, but I was fascinated. She also sort of lost interest in me. But I was fascinated by the class, and it changed the course of my life. I mean, here were two countries that I knew virtually nothing about, and yet, as Professor Vogel patiently and persuasively explained to all of us, we're destined to transform the world. I think the world will remember Ezra for the accuracy of that prediction, for the depth of his knowledge, the rigor of his research, of course, and his extraordinary language abilities. But those of us who were his students will also remember him for his compassion, for his kindness and curiosity. He was remarkable in that way. He was like no other professor I have ever seen or experienced. He took genuine interest in all of his students year after year after year. He kept very close contact with all of us over the years. And he played a decisive role in several key junctures in my life, including helping me to land my first real job in Asia as a staff writer for the Japan Times, taking over for his son Steve, who I believe is on the call. And later, when I went back to Harvard as a graduate student, he offered me another fantastic job, which was to be his teaching assistant for his Industrial East Asia course, which I learned so much from, and I use that kind of knowledge and the insights that I gained from that, even now. He also had an extraordinary capacity for empathy, as the minister alluded. And in some small way, I hope that we can emulate that in our exchange here today. The wonderful thing about Ezra is that he really knew how to listen. It was almost like a kind of secret superpower for him, but it enabled him to really understand people from vastly different cultures. And it is what made him such a sought after expert in countries that had such diverse and turbulent histories. I just want to, before we start, read an excerpt from the intervention that the minister mentioned that Ezra penned in late 2020. He lamented that US-China relations in particular had deteriorated to the worst point since the reopening of relations in 1970s. And here's what he said. He said, instead of cooperating to cope with the coronavirus, we blamed each other for its origins. Instead of cooperating to maintain stable international economic relations, we carried on a trade war and disrupted supply lines, creating uncertainties around the world. Instead of increasing the number of reporters in each country who would promote mutual understanding, both countries imposed new restrictions that limit the number. Scholarly contact has been greatly reduced. Tensions over Taiwan and the South China Seas have increased. The risk of conflict of devastating consequences to both countries has also increased. None of these developments is in the interest of the two countries. Ezra urged a more constructive effort to expand the lines of communications, to understand the context, underlying areas of conflicts, and to focus on opportunities for constructive cooperation and collaboration. And my hope is that we can engage in this inaugural Vogel dialogue in that same spirit. And so with that, let me introduce our panelists very quickly. Professor Fang Dan is the director of China's National Economic Research Institute. He's also a professor of economics at Peking University and a former member of China's Central Bank and Monetary Policy Committee. Arunabh Ghosh is an associate professor of history at Harvard, a specialist in Sino-Indian history, an expert on China's use of data and statistics, and recently the author of the book Making It Count, Statistics and Statecraft in the Early People's Republic of China. Meg Rithmire is professor of business administration at Harvard University. She has a PhD in government from Harvard. She's an expert on comparative political development with a focus on China and Asia. Her first book is Land Bargains and Chinese Capitalism. It looks at the role of land politics, urban governments, and local property rights regimes in Chinese economic reforms. And she's a specialist, among other things, on how governments discipline businesses and how businesses adapt to different methods of being regulated. And then finally, Tanaka Hitoshi is the chairman chairman of the Institute for International Strategy at the Japan Research Institute. He is one of Japan's most distinguished diplomats. He has had every significant post that there is in the Japanese foreign ministry, and he is a former advisor to former Japanese Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi, and we're very lucky to have this august collection of distinguished experts with us. Let me open, perhaps, if I can, by asking each of you in turn to maybe just help us set the agenda for this discussion. We heard the minister talks about being at a high plateau of interconnectivity. And yet it seems like there are so many existential threats to that plateau that all seem to be kind of working together interactively. The pandemic has really limited the flow of people, ideas, goods, as well as data across borders. The rise of China has created, even before that, lots of inherent strains and conflict in the key relationship between those two largest economies in the world. And there is a lot of feeling that perhaps the connectivity went too far. A lot of people that want to retreat from it. So I wonder if I could, just to get us started, ask each of you to reflect for maybe 5 minutes or so about where we are right now in the world as we emerge from the pandemic, and maybe highlight for us what you think the biggest challenges are that the world, and especially Asia as a region, has to grapple with as we pivot out of this moment. And let me start with you, Professor Fan, if we can.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel and giving me this opportunity to commemorate the Professor Vogel. But everyone shares some stories of your stories with the Vogel, but you should allow me not jump into your topics, but give me the opportunity to share some of my story of Professor Vogel. I met him in middle of the 80s. I don't remember the exact date, but he came to China many times and we met time to time. And then in November 2018, he honored me to chair a seminar for me at the Harvard Asia Center. So that's the last time I met him. During that seminar, I already talk about the trade war, which already started. And we recall the good old days between two of us and two of the country in the 80s. But that's the last time I met him, and really sad when I heard he passing away. I think his most important legacy for us, for academic people, is his academic spirit, the objective, open-minded, in-depth, and thorough study. I think that was his doing. Think about his book of Deng Xiaoping. He spent over 25 years doing so many interviews, checked so many documents, checked the data, all the field works, so really deeply, and started with the language, started with the Chinese, the language. So that's what I think is so important. So I'm really glad we have this Vogel dialogue, so we can carry on his spirit, academic spirit, and to promote the mutual understanding of Asians and the Westerners and the different countries. So as you said, we are in the cross of the crisis, actually, of globalization. But I think that this pandemic really can give people the opportunity to think about the collaborations, think about the common goods, public goods, think about different models and different cultures dealing with this kind of the things. So without this pandemic, a lot of things are not reviewed. For example, how to deal with the public health, how to deal with the public goods provision of the country. We need a market, but at the same time, we need something which not actually trade at the marketplaces, but it's a common goods. So I think rather pessimistic about the future. I think this both the global climate change and the pandemic provide opportunities for people to rethink of a lot of things. And I think that this dialogue is also important to put all those things forward and to promote the more discussion of that.
We've had a bit of good news just in the last 24, 48 hours on the kind of US-China relations front. One is the word that there's a firm date now for a virtual summit between Xi Jinping and President Biden. The other is it looks like there's an agreement of some sort between the two countries on COP26 to tackle climate change. Are you more optimistic than pessimistic about this relationship getting back on track, or the other way around?
For that, I'm not quite positive. I think that there could be some marginal adjustment, like you mentioned the two things, but also people are talking about cut some of the tariffs, to make an adjustment of the trade policies. So that's also could happen. And then in the area of the global climate change and other things, China and the US always in collaboration. So that doesn't mean the big change of the equation. The fundamental equation is still there, so-called competition, strategic competition, for a while. We have to take that as a background for the next stage of development and the globalization. That are already I think the parameter we have to take for a while.
Meg, I wonder if we could turn next to you and just ask for your read on where we are at the moment. I mean, you are, among other things, a specialist on Chinese outward investment. You've looked very carefully at this big push by some of China's largest firms to go global. There has been a bit of a pullback since the sort of heyday of that moment. There seems to be a lot of reevaluation right now about China's economic presence beyond its own borders, and yet, as the minister suggested, we are still at this really high plateau. We're seeing Fortune Global 500 firms that are making tons of money in China every day, and if anything, China has become more important to them since the pandemic. I was just looking at the FDI numbers for the first half of the year. They're pretty solid, surprisingly, for China. Where do you see this headed?
Sure. Well, first, let me just say thank you for having me. It's such a privilege to be here, to honor Ezra in any small way possible, and also to share this panel with these people who I admire so much. So let me just take a page from how you sort of introduced the panel, which is that we're in this moment where we do have indeed interdependence, what scholars have for a long time called complex interdependence, which is not just, my country trades with your country, but really that our supply chains are so disaggregated and so complex as it sounds, that we're all sort of entwined in ways that we weren't even aware until suddenly at the beginning of last year, we were. And it's a moment where, even preceding, obviously, the pandemic, there were trends in a bunch of societies, mostly in Western societies, that had become quite skeptical of globalization, of whether it yields benefits, trade with China, excessively open borders to goods, to services, to capital, and indeed to people, and whether it benefits people in those societies. Whereas, my last time living in Asia was 2016 and 2017, where I spent time in Singapore and in Shanghai and traveled all over Southeast Asia. And there you get the opposite. That was during Trump's election in the United States, whereas my feeling in Asia broadly was that Filipinos and Indonesians were more excited than they ever had been for the range of opportunities that global openness was providing those countries. And so the thing about complex interdependence is that it's complex, as you say, and that there's no straightforward interest of any country or even any sector, right? So when we think about, people often ask me, what does American business want from China? And the answer is there's no such thing as American business and what they want from China. There's the tech sector, the agricultural sector, the manufacturers, the consumer goods, the financial interests, right? And they're all quite different. And so let me just say a couple of things that I think would be kind of interesting, and especially thinking in terms of Ezra's legacy, which is that we have to have a little bit of humility. I think we were all struck by every time, when I first encountered him as a first-year graduate student, arriving on campus, and he still was interested in what someone like me had to say and think. And he always had this amazing humility to him, which was just there until the very final moments, it seemed. And so some humility would do us good when we think about the United States and China, both of those countries, I think, at this moment, where, we're in this moment where we're nervous about the security implications of interdependence. And China wants to say that it's America's fault, right, for restricting access to high tech goods, or, abusing its role as a hub in international technology markets, export controls, or the international financial system. And then I think, and on the other hand, people have real concerns in China about the increasing role of the state in China's economy, whether it's easy to disentangle firms from the state in China. And we're seeing all kinds of reactions from not just the United States, but countries all over the world to that blurring of the public and the private. And so some reassurance, I think, is due from both of those countries to say, we're not going to weaponize this and that supply chain. We can agree, for example, that people are going to need pandemic supplies. They're going to need cooperation on basic consumer goods because we are so deeply entangled in these supply chains. And so some humility would do us well. And the second thing that I think is important, just remembering Ezra's background as a sociologist, is that a lot of the anxiety, both within China and the United States and between the two countries, really comes from issues of status. And the #1 bestseller that was a surprise that that you referenced is, of course, Japan is #1. And one thing that we have to embrace in the United States is that we will be #2 in terms of the largest economy in the world. We cannot stay the largest economy in the world, and that we don't have to in order to live with ourselves. And so a lot of what's happening both in American politics and I think in Chinese politics is anxiety about status, about retaining that status. And we have to take those things seriously. So not just writing it off as a bunch of American crazies doing this or that, or, a power grab on the part of Xi Jinping, but thinking very deeply about the real, very real social fractures that have, been generated by globalization, but are also, reactions to globalization in these different economies. And if the United States can take China's domestic status issues seriously and really be empathetic towards them, and the reverse can happen, I think we'll be in a better position. But we are in a period of complex interdependence, and it's very complex, and the interests are not aligned between governments and states, and that's the central problem. And the last thing I'll just say is that one of the last things that Ezra said to me as the pandemic was striking, and I said, I'm just so nervous, when am I going to get back to China? And he said, let me just remind you that careers are very long. So if it takes him 25 years to write an excellent book about Deng Xiaoping, we can all be a little bit patient and not be so trapped in this moment that we can't see the possible good that might unfold in the next couple of decades.
That's a great reminder, a really good sense of perspective. I have to say, having just come back from Shanghai and endured the weeks of quarantine that was necessary to get in, and then seeing the tremendous quarantine that people have to go through in Hong Kong to get back here when they return from high-risk countries, it feels like this moment is really taking a long time to leave us. So Arunabh, let me turn to you next and ask your thoughts about kind of where we are right now. I'm struck in particular by Meg's comment about we should all prepare for the time when China is #1 and America is #2 economically. There's a bit of a debate about that among economists and analysts. You're a specialist on Chinese data, Chinese economic data, among other things. How does it look to you, and kind of what's your thought about where the region is right now?
Thanks, Clay. And before I try and get to some of those thoughts, I want to echo what has already been stated about Ezra and about his legacy, and also I think mention one particular quality I think that hasn't really come up, but I think was so central to Ezra, the way he carried himself, the way he was as an intellectual, and that was actually his industry. And I have these wonderful stories from very good friends of mine who happen to be tenants of his these past several years. And they lived on the top floor of the house Ezra owned, and in sort of arriving late in the evening or leaving early in the morning, they would often pass by his desk or his office, and he was always working. And every even if he had a snippet of time, he'd be writing or reading something. So this sort of this engagement, even late into his life, was something I think that hearing about it and then observing it was a sort of truly inspirational. The other thing I'll mention very briefly, and it sort of connects with what Meg just mentioned in terms of sort of long careers. The other thing I think that's really worth remembering is that Ezra produced some fantastic work on China without ever actually visiting the mainland. In particular, his first book, Canton Under Communism, which is how I was introduced to Ezra the scholar, actually, in grad school. When I read that book, I was quite blown away, actually. And of course, he did this without ever stepping foot in Canton. So as we look forward, we might be entering, I don't know how long this phase might be, but the possibility remains now that the scholars who are based in the US or in other parts of the world, we may not have the opportunity to be back in the mainland anytime soon. Ezra then serves as an inspiration again in pointing the way to the possibilities of producing fantastic scholarship in spite of what might appear to us, who are, I think, in some ways spoiled, that things are possible. So I thought, in terms of thinking about where things are right now, I want to offer two thoughts that in some ways I think may help us also both engage with Ezra's legacy, but also in some ways think about what is going on in Asia right now, and the extent to which Asia itself is an important category to work with. The first of these has to do with actually what Minister Shanmugaratnam mentioned as one of Ezra's, I think he called them, I forget what, qualities or features or characteristics, which was his insistence on the importance of the past. And here I think what is happening, not just in the US, not just in China, not just in a few countries in Asia, but I think is a relatively global phenomenon, is the ways in which the past is being mobilized in precisely binary terms, precisely in terms that are good, bad, and an attempt is being made to essentially elide the complexity of the past in similar ways to the way in which the complexity of the present, as Meg was suggesting, is being elided. And I see this as part of a larger trend, a larger problem across the world right now, where there is a fixation on certain kinds of knowledge, in particular technical knowledge, in particular knowledge that relates to science and technology, and it's almost universally at the expense of humanistic knowledge. It's at the expense of a range of social sciences. Mm-hmm. And I think this is not just a question of and the way it's being understood, of course, is that these things will allow us to grow in certain ways. It will allow us to build capacity in certain ways. But what I think is being ignored, and this is where Ezra's legacy is so important, it's precisely the fact that a humanistic knowledge which approaches someone else, whether it's a community, an individual, a country, with a certain degree of empathy, a certain degree of humility, a certain degree of small c Catholicity of mind, just that there is so much to learn and engage with, is extremely important, I think, to any kind of future that we might imagine. So here, within countries, there needs to be a debate again, in the US certainly, in China certainly, this is a problem in India as well right now, in terms of how we balance what we need to know, what kind of knowledge we need to be working with. So this balance between, and in the most reductive terms, is the balance between STEM versus sort of the more humanistic ways of knowing. So this is one thing that I want to sort of put forward as a real sort of as a way forward in terms of resolving this crisis, may resolve or provide grants for resolving other kinds of tensions. So this is sort of almost like a baseline condition. The second thing I want to mention is about the possibilities of thinking about Asia and about sort of how some of this social scientific or humanistic knowledge may apply to Asia itself. There has been, Ezra was so seminal in his sort of the pains he took to try and bring Americans and Chinese and Japanese also sort of towards a sort of mutual understanding. And I think some of that legacy and some of that energy is really needed right now within Asia. There is a tremendous amount of ignorance between Asian countries in terms of what is going on. So at one level, you see the kinds of things that I think are positive, the kinds of things, so RCEP, for instance, the ways in which that is perhaps reconceptualizing Asian space, but it's occurring at a time when there is actually a growth of ignorance about sort of each other in Asia itself. So in some ways, to look at what Ezra said about the US and China, or the US and Japan in an earlier era, and now those three countries together, and sort of to think about that within an Asian context also, to try and say that we need to have a greater degree of mutual recognition, mutual understanding, and this has to happen not just at the level of policy and trade, but at a sort of deeper level of understanding.
That's such an important insight, I think. We think of how extraordinary Ezra was in being, as the minister said, a bridge between the U.S. and China, the U.S. and Japan. One thing that I am acutely aware of sitting in Hong Kong and traveling often to China and India in the pre-pandemic era is that there are not very many bridges between the two most populous countries in the world, India and China. So, I mean, it's extraordinary to have you here. You're one of the few people that I know of that's got such deep knowledge of both India and China. But I'm stunned, particularly when I go to India, how little people in India know or understand about China. Even people that you would expect had visited China many, many times have never been. I remember being at a Times of India book festival, and they had a panel of like 8 experts on India-China relations. And it was revealed in Q&A that not a single one of the Indian panelists had ever been to China. So, it's an important thing. Tanaka-san, let me come next to you if I could. And give us, if you can, a Japanese perspective on where the world is right now. It's a really fascinating moment in that we've got not only now a new US president, but we've got a new Japanese prime minister, one that you know very well. He's just named his new foreign minister, someone that you're also very familiar with. How is Japan seeing this particular moment in the world? You have to unmute yourself there.
Thank you very much, Clay. Let me first do a kind of same thing as you all did. I'm very happy to be here with all those who have good and fond memory of Ezra Vogel. Let me introduce 2 episodes, which I remember all the time. One is 1990, I think it was 1995, when he came alongside with Joe Nye. At that time, Joseph Nye was assistant secretary for international security affairs at Pentagon, and Ezra Vogel was intelligence officer at NSC. And he took taxi cab in Tokyo, and he started a conversation with taxi driver. And taxi driver said to him, without identifying him as Ezra Vogel, he said, "You must be," I mean, knowing this fluent Japanese, "you must be either Harvard professor or CIA spy." He was at that time both of them. It was a great story. The second story I would like to share with you was it was probably 5-6 years ago. I was kindly invited by Ezra Vogel to Harvard, Holocaust born by Harvard University, 2 weeks. And one day he took me in his car. He and his wife took myself and my wife in his car to an Italian restaurant. That was the most scary time I ever had, because he was such a reckless driver. He sort of drive very aggressively, very dangerous way. So that was, I mean, at that time he was 80 something, but that was a scary time for me. let me explain my perspective about where we are in terms of the world in Asia. As everyone says, US-China relationship, how it developed, is a key question for us all. But I do think that US-China relationship today is far away from what we call Second Cold War. That was the characteristics of US-China relationship is entirely different from United States-Soviet relationship. I describe this relationship in 4 C's: military security confrontation, political competition, economic coexistence, and cooperation on global issues. The security confrontation, you cannot escape. Japan forming alliance relationship with the United States. We obviously side with US. And we have AUKUS, we have Quad type thing, and this will go on. This will go on, unfortunate. Second, the political competition. This is a question of regime. And I can't say that American regime is the best of the world. Chinese governance is the worst of all. I think we all need to improve the governance, the China and the United States as well, particularly in China relationship with human rights question and all sorts of things. The third question, the economic interdependency, the coexistence. We all talk about this question of economic security. We would have to define what it means, economic security. What is the precise scope of economic structure, economic security? Because it obviously relates to the first confrontation, military security confrontation. But that will have to be confined to a very clear concept. The fourth, cooperation, the on global issues. I mean, I am very pleased to hear that there was a joint communique, joint statement between United States and China for the cooperation into this decade on the question of the global warming. This is a good step of the global cooperation. The issues such as North Korea nuclear issue, I would put it in the same category. United States, China, Japan, Korea, they all have the common interest in seeing North Korea denuclearize themselves. Therefore, I mean, this is the 4 elements which we will have to make right management. If balance is destroyed, then we may lead up to a true Cold War situation like United States and Soviet Union. But in this context, we need to address 2 key questions: Taiwan and CPTPP. Question of Taiwan. If China were aggressive on Taiwan, meaning that China uses military means to unify Taiwan, I have no doubt whatsoever that the United States will intervene militarily. And I have no doubt in my mind that Japan will support the United States to intervene militarily, because if we did not, that would be the end of the Japan United States security alliance. So, I mean, this is the situation we need to avoid. So the whole question is how to avoid Taiwan crisis. You have to behave China will have to be very, very careful. Xi Jinping, I'm sure, will talk about the unification up until the time China sort of accomplished what we call China Dream in 1949. But yet, you must think that cost of the military attack on Taiwan would be extremely high. China would have to be separated from the international community as a whole. Now, second question of TPP. As we all know, China, Taiwan, UK all has extended their application. I think we should think of accepting all at one time, simultaneous entry on the part of China, Taiwan, UK would be the best for the future of CPTPP, because by having all those countries, we can maintain the balance. I do not believe the situation where China would be in and Taiwan is out. And I probably do not see a situation where Taiwan is in and China is out. So I think the best way for the stability in the region is to get Taiwan, China, UK at the same time. I should stop here. Thank you.
Let me just quickly follow by asking you about this question of kind of shift in leadership in Japan. There's been a lot of discussion in the Japanese press about increased prospect for a kind of warmer relationship between Tokyo and Beijing under the new prime minister, and certainly the fact that he's just named Hayashi-san as foreign minister would seem to play into that narrative. But what's your take on that?
This is the very question which was discussed earlier, the question of public sentiment.
Yeah.
Indeed, there has been a change from the rather conservative government to the new prime minister, Kishida, who is said to be more liberal than other factions. But yet, he has to run the nation with the strong public sentiment. People say that 90% of Japanese public are anti-Chinese. And that is like in the United States, that public sentiment is growing. The politicians cannot divorce himself from the strong public sentiment. And I am sure that the Prime Minister Kishida, alongside with Hayashi, good friend of mine, who do their best to cope with the situation. Next year, we celebrate 50th anniversary of the normalization of the relationship. But yet, I think, as I said, this is the very complex situation. Japan is an ally with the United States. China is top economic partner for Japan.
Right.
And there is a need for precise strategy for us to operate. And I think we can do that. And therefore, Japan is in a good position to talk to the United States and to talk to China so that we can maintain the balance, I said. Cooperation, competition, coexistence, and confrontation.
Well, this gets back to Meg's point about complex interdependence. I mean, you just encapsulated right there why Japan's, very, very complex interdependence, both on the United States and on China, and trying to negotiate that, how difficult it is. Meg, let me turn to you next. And Tanaka-san mentioned Joe Nye. He has been in the New York Times recently weighing in on this question of whether we're headed for a Cold War or not. He says it's a lazy, dangerous metaphor and counsels against using it. And yet, doing a little bit of homework on this the other day, I'm struck by the just incredible spectrum of US foreign policy elites who use this phrase with increasing frequency. And it goes from Graham Allison to John Mearsheimer to you can go right around Henry Kissinger, Neil Ferguson, world without end. You can get experts who are actively using this term and say, look, we have to recognize that the confrontation aspect of this is inevitable and it's going to get more dominant. What's your take on this debate?
I would have to agree with Professor Nye that, and I would also recommend an essay by Tom Christensen, who I know, another a scholar who I know that Ezra very much respected, who has written in Foreign Affairs, that it's basically not the right analogy for a number of reasons. And the most principled reason is that there's not an ideological conflict. I mean, there's not. How do I tell my students? There's not an ideological conflict between China and the United States, yet the conflict does have ideology to it in some ways. And so what really, and what is worth profoundly, so you just named a lot of men that have a lot of opinions on Cold Wars, and I also told you about Tom Christensen, but another person who's been vocal about this is Jessica Chen Wise, who's also written in Foreign Affairs that basically China, in contrast to a lot of the things that I hear from particularly from American politicians, who have complex goals themselves. China is not engaged, in anyone's view, in a project to convert the world to its way of doing things. And in fact, if you read any significant speech from any significant Chinese leader for the past 70 years, what you realize is that almost none of them think that China's experience, whether past or deeply present and contemporary, is replicable almost anywhere outside of China. There are certain things that China does and that thinks it does, like its infrastructure model, right? Its model of some kinds of meritocracy in China that might be replicable outside of China, but there's not a sense that China's on a mission to turn the rest of the world into China. And so in that sense, it's very dissimilar from the Cold War, where it really was a sense that if you're with us, then you're with us, and if you're with them, then you're against us. And so just to go back to the minister's keynote speech, this kind of binary thinking is part of the problem. And we've seen a lot of that, I think. Some mistakes, right, have been made on the part of American, the crafters of American foreign policy, particularly with things like the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, right? So not signing up for that, not realizing, right, that there are moments where we are actually all playing by similar rules. And even with the Belt and Road, if you accept Belt and Road financing, then somehow now you're in the pocket of Beijing and you're doing something different. That's the kind of Cold War thinking that both kind of eliminates opportunities for all kinds of actors from both China and the United States to interact in a more productive way, and kind of contributes to that binary thinking that the minister, I think, correctly warned us against. And so, you have to kind of ask yourself, what does China really want? And Jessica Chen Wise's answer to that is a world that's safe for China's own political system. And so whatever assurances that the United States can make to say, look, we don't have any designs on regime change in China, we're not interested in that. No one's going to tell China how to run China. And just as well, we prefer that you don't tell us how to run ourselves, which China has no interest in doing, I think, at all. And so in that sense, I think it's a very different thing. And the other thing there's so profoundly different about the Cold War is that we didn't have that kind of complex interdependence, not with anyone, much less with the Soviet Union, right? And so the fact that American business of its, of all different stripes is so embedded in China, and really Chinese cultural educational interests are so embedded in the United States, right, is really an opportunity to think a little bit beyond that kind of metaphor. And the phrase that we're hearing a lot, both in China and the United States, is a whole of society, right? That the United States sees China as the whole of China's society as a threat to the whole of American society. And China, Xi Jinping, that's originally his phrase, to mobilize the whole of Chinese society to develop in a certain way. And so I don't see things that way. I don't think the whole of China's 1.4 billion person society can be mobilized to do any particular thing at any particular time. And so the more we can resist that kind of thinking, and maybe we should perhaps just take this opportunity, as Professor Fahn said at the beginning, to be a little more creative in how we think about things, both our public goods models and our historical analogies. And I don't think the one that immediately comes to mind, it is rather lazy, I would say. So in Joe Nye's words, not my own accusation, but I quite agree with him there.
Can I ask you, one of the great casualties of the pandemic, and also kind of the rising tension in the US-China relationship, has been new barriers to cross-cultural exchanges. I mean, this was something that was so important, obviously, to Ezra. I was struck in Shanghai last month talking to, I had a lot of meetings with people who are long-term residents of Chinese cities that are business people. And they said that there's been a real shift of mood. It's not just that people aren't crossing borders back and forth, but it's harder for multinationals to hire Chinese. There's less interest on the part of really bright, aspiring Chinese students to go work for global companies. They want to work for Chinese companies. I talked to a couple of big global brands who said it's harder to sell our products to Chinese. Whether it's Nike or Adidas, that we're getting all this competition from local brands, which have more appeal. I talked to some entertainment executives who said, Hollywood movies are not as interesting to Chinese anymore as they used to be, and box office is up. It just seems like sort of factor after factor after factor, there seems to be this cultural unwinding, decoupling that matches the economic and kind of technical spat. And I'm just curious, maybe you or Arunabh, what's your perspective of how it looks from being at Harvard? Because this is a very unscientific question, but Harvard, I know, has often been a huge bellwether of what sentiment in the United States is with regard to the future. When I went as an undergraduate, everyone wanted to, Japan was a serious place that everyone wanted to go to and learn about, and the number of people taking Japanese, enormous. And then when I came back later and was at the Fairbanks Center for a while, it was all China. There were so little interest in Japan that year that they actually canceled the first year intensive Japanese course because there weren't enough students to justify it. Where's the thinking on China now at Harvard?
Maybe I'll just say something quick and then let Arunabh come in. And quick and sad, I think I'm sorry to say. So 10 years ago, when I first started teaching at Harvard Business School, my students would come to my office hours and I would say, why did you take my class? And they would say, I wanted this class with you because I know you know about China and I want to learn about China because that's the future. And now they come and they say, I'm taking this class with you because I want to learn about China because I think that's our enemy. And these students have not been to China. They don't really understand much about China. And so that there's interest there, but the genesis of that interest is very different. And so we are in a pretty delicate moment. And as an instructor, my goal is to convey complexity and nuance. That it's not all what you think it is, and that there's a lot of different things going on. And the other thing I'll just say there about education, I know Professor Bill Kirby will conclude tonight, is that the one place, or tonight or tomorrow morning, as it is in Asia, the place that when I said, the US might be number 2 in terms of its economy, educationally, it still seems to me that most of the world wants to come to the United States. And if we fail to convey that complexity, and if we as academics, there's an interesting history there when countries get caught up, right, in what they think of as existential conflicts, what happens to the study of things. And so it's really our job to protect that space and make sure that that we retain that status as, Harvard and the American educational system in general is a place that does convey nuance. And for that reason, people still want to come here from every country in the world. So that's the hill I would personally die on, a space to preserve. But I'm interested to hear what Arunabh has.
Arunabh, what do you think?
So before I say anything, I just want to add a quick thought to the previous the question about the Cold War. And my sense is, in addition to it being lazy, I want to also suggest that it's actually rather comforting because the US won the Cold War in this particular narrative.
Yeah.
So to deploy it, I think, brings a certain comfort to the way in which you can then describe what is going on. It might be very different if the Cold War had a sort of different outcome, and in 1991 the Soviet Union had not collapsed. So just a thought there. But on the question of Harvard as a bellwether, I think in some ways the university is a bellwether, but in some ways I think it is also not representative, because I think we will always get students from all over the world, including from China, and some of the brightest students from China across the entire sort of from the STEM into the humanities and social sciences and other disciplines. I'm a little more sanguine than Meg is in terms of the students that I teach. I teach almost every year a sort of a survey on 20th century Chinese history, and I get a sort of a range of students who come in, some freshmen, sophomores, in some upperclassmen, and then occasionally, of course, grad students and other visitors. And often by the end of the semester, the kind of the sense I get from the students in conversations during office hours or outside is actually a greater appreciation and a greater empathy for why certain positions are valued in China right now, or why certain things, why the response is so prickly, why is this so important, whatever is agitating people. So I'm a little bit more sanguine about the fact that this is actually serving some kind of purpose. We are not contributing in some ways to the creation of new easy binaries. And so it might be a slight generational thing, because Meg sees essentially people who are slightly older, who have already worked for a while, so the demographic profile is different. But to some extent, I'm sanguine, hopeful. These are the words that come to mind more than sort of being completely sort of distraught. But I think that the larger picture in the US is less promising right now, in as much as if you look at the overall number of students that the US that were in the US from China, that number has declined. And this has sort of multiple sides to this. This is, of course, the fact that this feeds into sort of the bilateral tensions. It also feeds into the ways in which the economic models that are in place in many universities, where this is a major source of income, these kinds of problems. But the other thing to bear in mind, perhaps, is that what we saw in the starting in the 80s, and to which I think Ezra played a huge sort of contributing role, is that the US and China became really close together. So now there's a long history of the US and China being intertwined in complex ways. John Pomfret has written a fantastic book about this. But I think you can think of the 80s, 90s, and the first decade of the 21st century as an era when that relationship was really, really sort of close. And perhaps what we might be witnessing also is a slight sort of a return to a different kind of equilibrium that does not necessarily sort of completely dissipate, but we won't see the kind of intense engagement that we saw in, say, the last 10 years. So that's another thing to bear in mind, I think. So not to panic too quickly.
Professor Fan, I wonder if we could ask your kind of take on that. I mean, there has been a lot of coverage in the Western press, just even in the last week, on this theme that China is becoming more insular. And a lot of people have made a big deal of the fact that Xi Jinping hasn't traveled out of China for 21 months now and didn't go to Glasgow, and have mentioned some of these other things about students and companies that I saw when I was in Shanghai last month. Do you think that's a fair assessment, or is that a mischaracterization of kind of the mood among students, among business people in China right now? I think you're on. You got to unmute. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I haven't traveled abroad for more than 24 months, so that's not only his problem. When the whole country have this kind of the quarantine policy, I think it's hard for him to take the example that he's go out without quarantine and come back. So I think that's one of the reasons. Of course, there's other reasons if he's comfortable now to meet with all these global leaders. But anyway, well, I would have two comments on previous conversation on the Cold War and on the trend of the business in Chinese market. Well, I think in China, I think the most people, the sentiment of most people, majority, I would like to say, is that we don't want to have the war. You know, no matter it with the United States or Taiwan, you know, we don't want to something interrupted this growth and economic development and the social development. I think that's a kind of you know, sentiment is very strong. You know, not only because China is still not you know, strong enough to make the confrontation with the U.S., but also people understand that the China suffered from wars and too much in the past. We should avoid it. You know, we have this one generation, two generations peacefully, you know, live in the world, and we have you know, globalization. People enjoy that, so people don't want really interruption of that. So I cannot comment on, you know, politicians, you know, leadership. I don't know, but generally speaking, I think the mood is not really want to have a Cold War or real hot war. And secondly, about your comments on the trend in the Chinese market, I think the ministers, senior minister Tillman's comments of the development is truly important. Not only right now, since the maybe from the 2015, when China should have graduated from the WTO conditions, Chinese companies have been growing rapidly in terms of technology and the goods they produce. So they really start to have a competition with the foreign companies. So it's a natural process of development. Now people turn more on Chinese goods, not the foreign goods. But that's a natural process of when Chinese product really increase, really improving in their plantation. So I think that kind of a competition is the trend. More competition of Chinese company in the global market and also in domestic market. So Chinese domestic market is quite open. I mean, quite international. So that kind of things will continue. So that from that point of view, people enjoy this diversities, enjoy this competition and the coexistence with the multinationals. And I think the government policy is keep Chinese market open and open further. Before actually, you have to admit it, when the U.S. have the trade war with China, China did have a lot of problem, which set the restrictions, should remove some restrictions after WTO, up till graduation, we will say that. But China didn't do that. So that's make the American companies feel unfair competition. So now people try to fix those kind of problems, make the market more fair. So I think basically that is still the trend, not the otherwise.
Yeah. A couple of things that are really interesting to me. I mean, your comment about Chinese companies coming into their own as competitors. I mean, we definitely see that at Fortune. This is the second year in a row that on our Fortune Global 500 list, Chinese mainland and Hong Kong companies combined exceeded the number of American companies on the list. That's true by a wide margin, and we're watching that margin grow every year from now on. And if you add Taiwan to the mix, it's an even wider margin. So that's a big difference. I mean, the sense that I got from talking to people last month is that there's a kind of, I don't know, I mean, just walking around Shanghai feels very lively, it feels very open. It doesn't feel like there's any kind of economic difficulty there. But one thing I really noticed is not many foreigners, places where usually you see a lot of foreigners there, they just weren't there. And the Chinese seem to be okay with that. And there was a kind of feeling in the conversations that I had, people said, we're prosperous, we're big enough, we're rich enough, we're successful, advanced enough now that we're not as dependent on US technology or as we were. And there are a lot more opportunities for us just right at home within our own market, which to me was kind of interesting and felt a little bit new. I don't know. Tanaka-san, how does it look to you? I mean, Japan has kind of been wrestling with its role in the global economy for some time. Is sentiment among younger Japanese that they see their opportunities outside of Japan or inside of Japan?
Well, I mean, this is COVID. So after this pandemic, what will happen? That is a question. I am entirely sure that when pandemic is over, we would like to see lots of Chinese coming to Japan because about 30% of total inbound to Japan. Yeah. Chinese. And Chinese spend a huge amount of money on us. That is, and again, even in Japanese university, these days, full of Chinese students, and they are financially in a debt problem. If Chinese students were not to come. So I would very much hope that China would send as many people as possible to Japan. But yet our problem, I mean, as you say, China becoming insular, that may not be too much a problem, but the whole question is from the particular moment, probably 10 years ago, China becoming very aggressive in terms of utilizing economic might for sake of diplomacy, vis-a-vis, Norway, vis-a-vis Australia, vis-a-vis Japan, vis-a-vis South Korea, vis-a-vis the Philippines, and vis-a-vis Canada. And we are very, very sort of in trouble because of the economic sort of element we thought is an element for peace. But yet all of a sudden, Chinese are using economic method for the sake of diplomacy. And again, Chinese is expanding its military capability at a speed nobody imagined. And the question of South China Sea, East China Sea, and all sorts of things. And we all of a sudden saw Chinese kind of departure from what we call two system, one state method in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Very, very sort of surprising move on the part of China. So this is it. I think without all those, China should have enjoyed economic prosperity. China could have been leading the world in relation to very many things. So this is a problem. I think it'd be easy for China to get rid of all this aggressiveness in terms of international community, because China is benefiting out of all this interdependent world. So I think China must think again, what is the best for China? And if China were to change that attitude, we shall help, we shall cooperate, and the United States will take different attitudes.
Yeah, I mean, I shouldn't speak for China, but I would say, in China's defense, one could say that the US has also been pretty aggressive in throwing its economic weight around in recent years. I want to sort of ask about one aspect of that, and I don't know, perhaps Arunabh, you're a kind of good person on this question, but the minister mentioned data and flows of data, and made the case that it's a non-rivalrous good, and that the more data there is, the better off we all are. But that doesn't seem to be the prevailing view among a lot of regulators in Asia or in the United States. There's a new wariness about data going beyond borders. What do you make of that? And where do you predict we're headed? I mean, there is this argument, you've probably seen this book by Kai-Fu Lee about AI superpowers that claims that we're in this kind of new arms race that uses data and algorithms, and that the world is going to sort of be reduced to vassals of the United States and China because they're the AI superpowers. But data is your specialty. What do you think about this?
So I think the minister was, was speaking in very idealistic terms. I think in when we think about data, and we think about data commensurability, data interoperability, the free data being freely accessible. I think these are all sort of values or virtues that we aspire to, especially in an increasingly interconnected world. But I mean, if you look at the actual history of data, the data is always an extremely political thing. And in certain contexts, it has, from its very the way in which whether it's states or other kinds of communities of experts have conceptualized data, that itself has major differences. And I think in certain parts of the world, and this is certainly true of the longer legacy of thinking about data in China, there is a sense that all data actually is a state secret. And these are things that are something that the state has to protect in service of the nation. which is a very different kind of ethos than this kind of much more idealistic position that all data should be freely available. So you have this longer legacy of different trajectories of thinking about data and the ways in which data is produced, and then who produces it and how it's analyzed. But I think what we are in a position where a lot of that older history is in some ways not as useful anymore because of the massive sort of both qualitative and quantitative changes we've seen in the past 10, 15 years. So the rates at which data is now being produced, the kinds of agencies that are able to collect data, one of the big transitions we've seen, I think, right now is from data collection being an active kind of exercise where you conduct a survey, you conduct a census, or you have agencies that go out and collect financial data or ask data to be reported, and then they collect it, collate it, and analyze it, whether it's through a Bloomberg terminal or something else. You have that, of course, continuing, but a lot of the data collection is now passive through our day-to-day habits. So whether whatever app you have on your phone, anything that you do is generating data that then is being in some ways mobilized for other purposes. It's being sold, it's being commercialized. But then this question of other tools that are being developed now, so the development of AI, the development of all kinds of sort of algorithmic analysis that is being done at scale that was almost unimaginable 10, 15 years ago. So this is, I think, we're in actually fairly uncharted territory, I think, in terms of what this means. And I'll give a very simple example of why I think this is fundamentally completely new terrain. And this really has to do with the fact that there is an interesting transition going in. If you look at data scientists and the ways in which they work with data right now, there is sort of a tremendous confidence in being able to work with data at scale so that you can start building models that are predictive. So you can sort of, this applies to sort of the market and commercial kinds of decision making, but in theory, it can apply to pretty much anything you want. If you have enough data, and you can actually build models that are fairly good at predicting certain kinds of outcomes. What this does, what this sort of push towards prediction does is it sort of undermines an earlier mode of dealing with data, which was really not about so much prediction, but about inference, trying to understand how things happen and why they happen. So there is a sort of epistemologically, we are in this moment where there's a major shift going on from being less concerned about explaining why something happened and being much more concerned about, well, what is going to happen? And then I'm going to decide what to do based on what the data and the modeling is telling us. And this has, as I said, this is uncharted territory, because once you take away an understanding of why things are happening, you are removing there's sort of a whole set of morality, of ethics, and a normative idea of society that goes with that construction of why. And we don't know what will go with the construction of what in some ways. So this is, I think, it's a very deep-seated challenge, not just to China and the US and the ways in which they are using data, whether it's in sort of, where the armed forces are doing it in terms of AI and sort of predictive analytics and so on. But it's at a much more fundamental level, a major challenge, I think. And I don't think we have good answers right now. And this is where the danger that I alluded to earlier, I think, is particularly acute when if we stress certain kinds of STEM expertise, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics, without some of this other sort of deep thinking about, what kind of society do we want? These are normative questions, philosophical questions. If we set them aside and emphasize only the what, we're going to be in much deeper trouble than I think we can even imagine. So it's a slightly more philosophical kind of point, but I think this is something that we haven't really been grappling with enough.
No, it's a great point. I'm just thinking about how this stuff all weaves together. And it just strikes me that one of the kind of unintended consequences of the pandemic is that it has pushed this focus on data and digital everything, into hyperspeed. At Fortune, we do conferences all the time, and people have been talking about digital transformation for like a decade, and it's sort of a buzzword that they throw around. But when you actually get into companies and poke around, you find that most companies have usually got the chief information officer or chief technology officer sort of leading these little siloed digital transformation experiences experimentally. But that's really changing. What we are finding now is company after company after company, people are seeing that you can really get competitive results by digitizing everything. And so the CEO is rolling up his sleeves and saying, I'm the chief transformation officer on this. And they're really rolling it out in every business group that they have. And it's no more just, it's not just talking anymore, people are actually doing it. So it's creating all this digital expertise, and what do you what do you do with it? I think it's a kind of an interesting.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And if I can add just two quick examples, I mean, the ways in which this has affected, for instance, censorship in China, the ways in which the state can track at scale the kinds of conversations going on and control them is one instance of, where you see this being used in, less, say, idealistic terms, perhaps, right? So sort of what we would hope for is one thing, and what we see is another. And then the other thing, which perhaps people have seen in the news, is the ways in which Facebook was actually intervening in the domestic politics of India in terms of promoting certain kinds of hate speech quite actively. So there's just two examples where you can see it being, used for fairly nefarious kinds of purposes.
Meg, I wonder if you could just react to Arunabh's first statement that data is always political. Does the abundance of data, and especially at the kind of company corporate level, our new reliance on it as a tool, a weapon of kind of competitiveness, does that change the dynamics of the economic competitive relationships among nations? Is this something new that political scientists need to think about as they, I hear this phrase all the time, data is the new oil. I'm not sure what that means. I mean, oil was something that you would go to war over, with gunboats, but is data like that? And is there something different that it lends to international affairs?
What a great question. And of course, everything's different. Nothing is the new oil, just like nothing is the new Cold War. But, I think data is part of, it's something I spend, a lot of time wrangling, myself, but not a lot of time thinking about. But it's part of a suite of things that we no longer quite know how to deal with in terms of globalization and how globalization is managed. And so it's one of the many things that we think of as now dual use or even omni use, right? So it used to be that you could have a pretty clear delineation between what was a weaponizable product or technology or flow across borders, and now we don't know what the answers to that are. And so, when we talk to my students about, why is it that, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States would have misgivings about a Chinese company owning, the rights to a gay dating app in the United States, and it's like, well, how could data be weaponized in these ways? And so it's one of the many things, and you're just hearing Arunabh talk about it, this question of interrogating the social foundations of our philosophies of how we do these things that applies to a wide range of things, not just data. Of course, biotechnologies, and when you look at the list of frontier or critical infrastructure controlled sectors that now appear on export controls and things like that in the United States, you could have a philosophical discussion, and we really indeed ought to, about how those things should be governed and in each possible example. And so, so I take Arunabh's comments very seriously, that in fact, there's a lot about the US-China relationship and about globalization that requires a moral reasoning and a moral interrogation beyond just what's in our interest and how, and it's not a technical solution to how to manage these things, but really what kind of society do we want to build? And then we're back to, the pandemic being an invitation to rethink some of those foundations. And I think that's an exciting time, if also kind of a daunting one, but I take that invitation very seriously as well.
That's fascinating. Professor Fan, if I can ask you, the Chinese government has really focused on data domestically within the last, especially 6 months. And there's been what gets described as a regulatory crackdown against big technology, particularly these kind of consumer-facing internet companies in China. Do you work, and you can make a case-by-case argument for why these crackdowns were justified in almost every case. I mean, for example, there was a lot of anti-competitive behavior by the e-commerce companies. There was a lot of excess manipulation by the education tech companies. You can find good reasons for the crackdown sector by sector, but do you worry as an economist that at some point the combined impact of all these things works against the creative destruction that that the minister mentioned? I mean, does it cost growth and innovation for China? I think you're still muted there.
Is it okay?
Yes.
Well, maybe the second question first. Of course, when so many ministries come up with the new policies, which try to regulate more industries, that caused the very combined negative impact on the economic growth, and we saw that. We saw that in the third quarter particularly. But there's one thing we have to remind you, that ministries are not coordinating on the timing of their policy issue. They all have their mandate. They all have their problems and issues, and they work on that. And when it come up with the solutions or policies, it's not coordinated. That's one thing. Maybe there are some of the so-called common rhythm of this timing issue. That is, of course, political timing. Next year would be the so-called 2020s party's Congress. That's the promotion time. That's the delivery time. You all ministries, you have to deliver. Right. Your mandate, you have the order to solve some problems, but why you are still not yet to come? So this year is the year that you have to have some new policies. Education, the security, the data security, what else? The housing market, whatever. There's many ministries that they come up with the policy. So that's one thing we have to understand. The secondly, about the data, about the companies like Didi, policies, I would say actually Americans remind of Chinese government of the national security issue of data. Before, you mentioned the Chinese censorship. Before, data was the domestic political issue. Yeah. But then during this trade war, American repeatedly put the things as a national security issue. Right. Then the Chinese start to, to think about this data issue. How the foreigners could use this data. The DD thing is mainly about this, where your data put off. If you list it in the United States, how the United States have the control or have the use of your data, of the Chinese citizens and the Chinese societies, or how the Tesla driving through Chinese street and discover, have the records of some Chinese institutions. So that kind of things, come up very lately. Before Didi, people didn't mention this, didn't realize this issue. But Didi became the first example how the Chinese company list outside and where their data put up and how to use the data, how the American authorities have the control, have the hand on that data. So I would say this is become international. The data things in China become international political issue, no longer only the domestic political issue.
So fascinating. I mean, so in other words, the U.S. making all this fuss over something like TikTok was a kind of a wake-up call for regulators in Beijing.
That's right.
Why are the Americans paying so much attention to that data? Maybe we should be worrying about that sort of thing as well.
That's right. That's right.
Really something. Professor Ron, I want to just ask you quickly, if I can, what's your outlook for the Chinese economy right now? There is a lot of concern that it's slowing. And then there are all these underlying demographic and other challenges. Yeah. Are you optimistic about where China's economy is headed?
Well, not very optimistic. I think the slowdown is going on. Yeah. One of the reasons of this year's slowing down actually still the pandemic. We have the control of a pandemic, but the little burst, we call the little burst of the cases somewhere here and there, that's interrupted a lot of things, interrupted the tourism, interrupted the travel, all the service sectors. So that make the economy really slowing down. That is still the major factor, you know. The second factor, of course, is the housing market. But I'm not too worried about the housing market. People talk a lot, you know, some big companies have trouble on the repayment of the debt. Think about this way, since 2010, after the crisis, after Chinese government adopted the stimulus package, after the package, after the stimulation, Chinese government adopted so many policies, try to crack down the housing bubble and put a lot of restrictions on the demand side. So the demand is still there. There's still a lot of restrictions against those demand. So it's not a demand issue in general. So that's why, and in the past 10 years, you look at the market, the prices increase annually, the 1% or 0 point something percent. It's another bubble. It's kind of the control of the bubble. And the Chinese, the household income increased by 5%, 8%, but housing market increased only by 1%. So that kind of situation is stabilizing rather than in the big trouble. So that's why, in general, I agree with the central bank assessment. This is another systematic issue, but there's other issues. One issue is a structural issue. Some small cities have the project, have housing, but then the people left. No purchasing power there. So that if the company have the project there, they will be in trouble. And thirdly, some companies really using the leverage to extend their business into other business. That caused the problem. That's caused the potential danger. That's a company issue. That's some company really bad on that. Not only this time. We have several cases in the past, in the Wanda and all things. Mm-hmm. So I would say, but current situation, few companies get trouble, have the negative impact on the general market and on the investment. So that's why investment is so slow at the moment. Monthly, compared to the 2019, it's only 4% growth. So that's a price that make the whole economy slow down. So from that point of view, I'm not optimistic about high growth, but also I'm not very pessimistic on the general situation. We are not on the edge of a collapse or crisis, just some slowdown.
We've got just a couple of minutes. I'm belatedly noticing that we have a question for Tanaka-san. It's about Taiwan. It says, with the close relationship Japan has built with both China and Taiwan, why doesn't Japan try to broker a peaceful dialogue between Beijing and Taipei to promote peace rather than deepen the animosity between the two sides? Is that a question that can be answered in 2 minutes or less?
Well, I think we would very much like to assist Taiwan, China having a good dialogue. But yet the current situation is far away from that. We have all this, the Chinese sending lots of airplanes on the Taiwan Strait, and Taiwan is preparing for Chinese invasion and all sorts of things. And again, I think what is important for us all is status quo. Status quo. Let us not ask Taiwan to be too aggressive for independence. Let us be asking Chinese to have a peaceful dialogue with Taiwan, because this is one China policy. Yes, America says so. I mean, Chinese say so. But yet, in 50 years ago, when we established diplomatic relations with China, we clearly stated what we are interested in is peaceful resolution of the issue, and I hope China will stick to it.
I think we are just coming right up on our time limit here. This has been a fascinating conversation, and we've covered a lot, but I feel like I have learned so much. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us and share your insights, and hope that this can be the first of other similar exchanges in the future.